Welcome back to episode 2 of Unleashed the Service Dog Gals. Today, Megan and Bridget are going to be talking about PTSD and how it's not just one story.
Hey guys, thank you for tuning in. My name's Megan.
My name's Bridget.
I just want to, before we get into our conversation today, I want to make sure that you're aware that the conversations we are going to be having on this podcast might be difficult for some to listen to, but it is very important that we do not sanitize this information because we are trying to change some things. And that means we have to get loud about it. With that being said, let's talk a little bit about how PTSD is not one story, but what is PTSD? According to the DSM-5, post-traumatic stress disorder is a mental health disorder that can develop after someone is exposed to trauma, specifically situations that involve death, threatened death, serious injury, and even sexual violence. So I don't know about you, Meg, but I think a lot of people feel like they understand PTSD already.
And what I would put out to our listeners is, what do you think about when you think of post-traumatic stress disorder? When you think of PTSD, what are the images that come to the front of your mind? And what we find is traditionally it's first responders, it's our heroes, right? That hero image of a first responder, of a war vet. And that's what we're discussing today is for the service dog industry. Those are the primary figures that are getting the PTSD dogs. That's where all the funding is, are these heroes, are our first responders and our war vets. And the systems were put in for a reason. You know, I'm a crisis counselor and I work with police officers. I know I work with first responders. I know what they see and what they experience and the trauma that comes from being a first responder, the trauma that comes from being a war vet and what they're exposed to and what they see and how that impacts them. And that's why these programs are there. And they're so important. They're amazing. I also worked as a service dog trainer, and I know how beneficial these programs are. Now, what we're talking about today is PTSD is not one story. It is not just first responders and war vets. There are also victims and survivors of crime that are suffering from PTSD because of what they went through. And we're not hearing those stories and we're not seeing that funding. And that's not being centered. So when you think of PTSD, do you think of victims of crime? My guess is no, unless you are one.
Unless you are one and you've been diagnosed with it by a mental health professional.
Yeah.
Because I think generally speaking, a lot of people see PTSD, like you said, through the predominant lens it's been framed in, rightfully so, because of what they're experiencing. But it is so much more. So when you think of PTSD, do you think that this idea of what PTSD is affects who gets taken seriously when they ask for support?
Yeah, I think there's a dominant narrative out there of what it is. And I think that dominant narrative that has been put out in the media, that has been talked about, is what influences who gets access to funding and who gets access to recognition. And what I will say is when you think of funding specifically, because here we're talking about who's getting left out for service dogs. When you think of funding and wounded warriors who are able to fund service dogs for PTSD service dogs, when you think of the different organizations where you can celebrate these heroes and celebrate these first responders and these war vets, you're not having a big celebration of, hey, I'm a survivor of a sexual assault. Hey, I'm a survivor of domestic violence. The person that was supposed to love me didn't. And not only that, he hurt me. And so we're not having this celebration. It's looked at more as a stigma. It's happening in isolation. It's happening in silence. And within that silence, we are not getting that out there to get the funding, to get the recognition that PTSD also affects civilians, specifically victims of crime. And that cohort, that group, is predominantly women. And so we're here challenging that we have to switch. We have to also include PTSD is not discriminatory in nature, but access to support dogs is with the current model.
So I have a question for you then, because we're talking about this idea that PTSD isn't one story, but and most of us know what that story is with veterans and EMS. What's the story? What is a PTSD story with survivors of crime?
I think it's very individual with survivors of crime. And like I said, it's happening in isolation. These crimes with domestic violence, that happens in the privacy of your own home, right? And then sexual assault, trafficking, it's all very private. It's isolating in just the very way that it happens. Whereas first responders, that's very external. It's happening in public, and there's so much awareness and so much attention to it. But again, when you don't have that attention, then you don't have that recognition, you don't have that funding. And so, to your question, which I forget what it is.
What do you think PTSD, like if we were to try and put an image of what PTSD is, like, is it the same as EMS? Is it the same as
It's the same in the fact that you, again, with this isolation, one is put out into the media, one is isolated at home, but PTSD is isolating. It is happening to you as an individual, and you can outwardly, you might look fine. You might, there might be some of those signs of PTSD where there's irritability, quick to reactions, maybe you're a bit more isolated than you used to be.
so can you talk a little bit about things like freeze, dissociation, appeasement, learned helplessness?
As I mentioned, it's individual. That the individual trauma that you experience is going to impact you different because we're individuals, we're
Yeah.
humans. We have different experiences that have shaped the way we live our lives, but also respond to exposures to trauma. And that's going to also influence how people have been affected or experiencing PTSD. Now, there's some people that are going to be outwardly, you're going to see it and it's going to be easily identified. Not easily identified, it's going to be recognized that there's been a shift. And as I had mentioned, quick to anger, irritability, but there's also the withdrawal, being in this freeze state where a sound can trigger someone and then they can't function because it has set them right back to that traumatic experience, or a smell, or it can be any type of trigger, but it just sets that person back into that trauma that they went through. And so each individual is going to experience it different.
I think what you're saying is this idea that, like, we've been talking about PTSD is understood as this one thing, but it really isn't.
No, it
Like,
isn't.
most of us imagine it to be one particular experience, but as you're saying, it's not. And even within those particular experiences, there's a lot of deviations, there's a lot of differences in how it comes out because it's so individualized.
Yeah.
So when we think about PTSD as being this one thing, here's the box we're going to put around PTSD, we're doing a disservice.
Here's the box we put around anything, we're doing a disservice because we're fluid, we're much more complex and complicated as human beings. And so to try and put something into a box, then naturally you're leaving out individual experiences or you're just leaving people out, which is what we are talking about today. It's not one story, but it is debilitating and it is very difficult for someone who is experiencing, and it can be very isolating. And so having that dog, and that's why people really do benefit from having service dogs. It's just, again, those quiet moments where you're having a disassociation or you're having a night terror or you've heard that sound or that smell, and that dog can sit there and help lower that heart rate, slow down the heart rate, lower the blood pressure, just help you calm down. It doesn't take that experience away. These dogs are not taking away your PTSD, but they are helping you. They really are. And that's what we're saying, is that one group is allowed and is supported to have these dogs, and a whole other group is being left out. It is not one story. It is not one group. There are so many people that have experienced it and that would benefit from this. And right now we're leaving those people out. And so what I want to shift to is talking about the financial strain and the financial reality of being left out. What we know about PTSD is that we're talking about victims of crime, and we're not saying it doesn't happen to men. It does. Men are victims of crime as well. There is a gender gap. Women are 2 times more likely to develop it than men are. And with violence, what we know from people that have gone through violence, it can be debilitating financially. So if you're thinking individually, if you're thinking a survivor of domestic violence, okay, now you're fleeing and you're starting over. You don't have anything. Or you have PTSD and you're not able to work. You survived, you went through this crime and this experience, but now what? You don't have those supports. You don't have access to those supports, or maybe you don't know that there's supports. There are supports out there.
But the supports did get cut.
For the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board,
Yes.
yes. So in 2019, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board was discontinued. That used to provide financial restitution to victims of crime. That was taken away. It was then filtered into another program, but there's a lot more eligibility and a lot more things that you have to go through. Those funds no longer go directly to the survivor, the victim of crime. They are now going to a third party agency, a third party organization that can support them. But again, there's people that are left out. When I say there are supports out there, I mean there are crisis lines, there are counseling supports out there. If you don't have the funds, they do exist. There are social programs in the community that you are able to connect with. But what I want to go back to is that financial strain is when you are the survivor. So maybe you can't work because you're working through PTSD, or you're just not in a place where you can do it, where you can function at work,
You're
right?
healing.
You're healing. Yes. And so maybe you're on social assistance. And what we know about social assistance, it is not enough for a living wage. It is not. It is not acceptable. It is not enough. You're already dealing with the trauma and you being a victim of a crime, but now you have to deal with the financial strain. So let's put that into service dogs. Maybe you benefit from a service dog, but you're not going to have access to it, or it's going to be very difficult. So the funding isn't there. Now, if the funding is there and you can't get a free service dog, I found 2 programs in Canada. There might be more. If there are, reach out. We would love to hear from you about civilian service dogs where they're able to come in. But right now, it is heavily catered to veterans and first responders.
Rightfully so.
Rightfully so. They need
their
it. They
dogs.
need it. Victims of crime also need it. They also are left out. And so in absence of a free dog and a funded program, what are they left with? They are left to train the dog themselves, which we all know how that goes. Maybe some it goes okay, but usually
The
it
vast
doesn't.
majority,
It doesn't. So then where's the next one? It's an owner train program. How much does that cost you when you already don't have money? Is that even accessible? It might not be. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Or
But if you're dealing with a financial strain, you're already disadvantaged.
you're already disadvantaged. And so the other one is the private route. But we know that service dogs cost $20,000 to $30,000 for a trained dog. When maybe you just got your housing, that took forever because there's not enough housing. We have a housing crisis. We have a shelter crisis. We have all of those.
And there's a housing crisis when you have a dog, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Not everyone, and I mean, even outside of service dogs, it's difficult to get housing if you have a pet. And if you have a service dog, you can't hide that you have that pet when you're trying to get that housing.
And so all of this to say that the options are crap for victims of crime. They are like, I just plainly, they are being left out. How can I afford $20,000 to $30,000? How can I afford to do an owner train program? It is so amazing that they are out there, but heck, we need funding. They need funding, and it's not there. And it's not to say that the nonprofit organizations that can provide the free dogs, or the organizations that maybe are, I don't want to get too much into Assisted Dogs International, like ADI standards yet. We will. Yet. But if they are not accredited and they are offering civilian support dogs and they're free, there's still that disparity in the funding that they have is primarily for first responders and war vets. And so the civilians are kind of put to the bottom of the list. And so there just isn't a great Yeah, there's just not a lot of options out there, and we want to address that gap. And even if there's the nonprofit, what I was trying to say was, even if there's the nonprofits that want to do this, they can't find the funding. The funding isn't there, and that's what we need. And so, shifting to funders, there's grants that you can reach out to as an organization to get funding. But what we have learned and what we have found is that when someone's putting out $30,000, they want to help a lot of people. They don't want to help one person. And that's the reality. They want their money to go far. And that's where these individual grants and donations and trying to get funds isn't working. We need that core funding to be able to support these programs. We need those systems in place that are not in place to support these programs. And heck, if you're someone out there that, has a passion for dogs, you want to support victims of crime in this, there are agencies that are out there. There are incredible agencies that are out there doing owner trained programs. Reach out, do your research, make sure it's a reputable place, but perhaps think of donating enough to train a service dog. Do your research though, because we want to make sure those standards are there. And here's the other piece. Here's the other piece of doing owner trained. So you go to an agency, you get your service dog, your name's on the wait list, but it's trained by a professional. You go to an owner trained. Yes, you have professionals guiding you, and you need that so that you can adhere to industry standards. You can make sure that dog is set to those standards. And a really good agency is going to make sure that happens. It's going to take longer because you are training your own dog. You have the guidance, but you're training your own dog. You don't have professionals just taking a dog, shaping it, training it, and sending it off
They
with you.
spend 5 days a week with these dogs. It is definitely a faster pace, and we're gonna get into standards and stuff in
Yeah, and
further
that will be a later
episodes.
episode.
But it is for sure, make sure if you are connecting with a service dog trainer owner that there is some type of accountability to industry standards, because that is important if we wanna make a change.
It is important, and what we know is when someone's in a disadvantaged financial state, you might try to find the cheapest one, and that doesn't always mean that those standards are there. And tune in to the standards episode later so that we can really dissect that and go through it, because we want to make sure that we're not just having dogs with vests. We don't like to see that. You just slap on a vest and bring the dog. Sometimes people just feel like they don't have options. And that's where sometimes those things can happen. Not always, but that's where those things can happen. So, again, in absence of programs and funding, people will turn to whatever means they have. And if you don't have much, like you might buy the Amazon $20 vest, slap it on and bring the dog in person because that's the only way you feel you can get out and be safe to be able to function in the world when you're suffering through something like PTSD. When I talk about isolation with PTSD, and I'm coming from I'm a crisis counselor. I studied sociology. I'm a service dog trainer. I'm not a psychiatrist. I'm not a psychologist. I understand, though, what those individual struggles can look like. I understand as a crisis worker being in this for 14 years, when I say isolation, some of the things that I'm talking about, and this might resonate with some people that are listening. Yeah, I definitely have experiences of vicarious trauma from the things I've taken in. And so when I'm saying isolation, it doesn't have to be in an isolated place. It doesn't have to be your home. It can be in a public setting, and those symptoms of PTSD start happening when you're having just a normal conversation and someone mentions something and it pulls you back into that trauma. And now you're left thinking about those traumatic experiences or things you've heard or things you've seen while trying to carry on these normal conversations. So when I talk about isolation, it's not just you're isolated in a place by yourself. You can also be isolated in public. And that's where those internal struggles come from. So, yeah, that's just what I'll
So
say about that.
So I'm not obviously a psychologist either. I'm a sociologist. So from a sociologist perspective,
Yeah.
we're talking about emotional labor or emotion work. That work that we do to put a smile on our face when we're struggling internally. Like that is a whole process of work that we have to put out.
When you think about a family gathering, let's say Christmas, right? Which can be holidays are very triggering. But yeah, you're putting on this, I'm so happy. It's such a joyous thing. And you go to the washroom and you're just like, oh my God, I can breathe for a second. And I think that's where the dogs can be really helpful because you don't have to say a thing. You don't have to say one thing to
You
them.
can just drop your hand down and just give them a pet and ground. Just
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why it's so important. I don't know. I'm getting emotional.
I'm getting emotional about this part too, because and I mean, I think this is a part we don't talk about, but people on the front lines like you experience vicarious trauma.
Yeah.
So this
I want to
is,
try to get through this because except for I can't talk when I cry, but this is why it's important for victims. Can you carry on? But it's so important because, gosh darn it, I think this is why we are so passionate about this, and we don't necessarily have to be psychologists or psychiatrists or trained in these things to identify that there are gaps and women are being left out. And we want to honor first responders and veterans, and we don't want to leave a whole host of other people because it's so important that they get their voices heard, that they get the supports, that they are entitled to make the same choice. Is a dog right for you? I don't know, but you want to have that choice. You want that option. And the option can't just be, well, you have to pay for it when you don't have the funds, because that's not fair. People are suffering, and we need to have those supports there.
we just want to grab a hold of these people who are left out and bring them over into the work that has already been established, the great work that people have done to establish these types of systems.
Yeah.
So, something I've been thinking a lot about, and you even touched a little bit on it, is this like gender. So, I want to think a little bit about how gender plays into all of this that we're talking about.
You have experienced it as a trainer, have you not?
Yeah, the gender thing I do experience, right? As a researcher in violence and domestic violence and that sort of stuff, it is very gendered, right? Women are more exposed to certain forms of violence disproportionately. Like we know the statistics of 1 in 4. We hear it often. 1 in 4 women are going to experience violence. And that's not to say that men don't experience it, but they experience it at a much smaller population size. What those numbers are exactly, I probably don't have in my head, but maybe if the listeners are interested in research studies, I'm happy to share some in the podcast notes if we think that would be helpful. But I think that the difference, like women are more likely to be dismissed. We know the story when it comes to violence. What was she wearing? It's a lot more victim blaming perspectives, right? So we dismiss women's experiences when it comes to these things. Think about the big narrative going on right now with the Epstein files, right?
Yeah.
Like how many women spoke out about it
You're not believed.
and they were still not believed. And even when the files came out,
You're blamed. It's not enough.
right.
Yeah. And men, you need to quiet up about it. You need to stop talking about it. When are we going to get past it? And it's just, we're in such a culture of victim blaming.
Yeah.
And yeah, that women are disproportionately affected and women are disproportionately left out. And circle back to the whole reason we're doing this episode. PTSD is not one story. It's not. We have to include the voices of women. It's not enough to just complain about it and identify it. It's let's get these conversations out. If this is resonating, what can we all do together?
Can I just like give us a little bit of a sidetrack? I don't know if
Yeah.
this is my teacher brain or what, but we keep talking systems. What
Mm.
the heck is a system?
Yeah.
I'm a sociologist. You study sociology. We both know what that is, but what is a system? So in sociology, we tend to think of systems. And I think the simplest way I can explain it without going into a 4-hour lecture on this
Which
topic,
I don't know that everyone has time for that.
but I think the simplest way I could explain it is systems are kind of those organizations, right? Systems are the legal system, right? The not for profit system, the policing systems, right? Those are systems. And then you might hear us refer to agency, which doesn't mean what you think it means, because I'm imagining you all think like an agency, like a police agency, right? But when we refer to agency versus systems, agency is the people within the system who are expressing ways to create change. Simplest way I can explain it, but I think that's important because you and I are talking a lot about systems.
Yeah, and I think that comes from just being in the system
Yeah.
that's not working. And so we interchange those words quite often. And yeah, thank you for breaking that down. I think it is important. Sometimes we go on our own little tangents in our own little world. But yeah, so thanks for that, Bridget. Okay, so we've talked about the gender gap. We've talked about who is left out. What systems need to be addressed and questioned? One thing we haven't talked about is a bit of a tough question to consider for anyone who is out there that thinks a service dog would be right for them. Is it? And that can be a bit difficult when someone has experienced trauma and maybe suffering from PTSD. It's what can help me? What can fix this? And there's many different things that you can do. But if you're relying on a singular thing, it's not going to fix it. And so to hope that, and I'm not saying everyone, but to hope that a dog will fix everything you're going through, it won't. And so we just have to be very cautious there that a PTSD, a service dog may not be right for everyone. And here are some of the things to consider is when you, well, there's the cost, right? If you don't get a free one, there's the cost. There's the commitment to training. Now, if you get a free one and or you pay for one and you get it to those standards, you're still having to train the dog. You have to continue with that. So you have to be able and willing to put in that work. Not only that, going out in public, it might help you get out there. You're going to get attention. You're going to have questions being asked of you. You have a dog in public. And while you can have the do not pet, naturally, human curiosity, child curiosity, there's going to be a tension around that. So that's something to consider. You're also going to, it's not if, you will experience public access challenges. So I don't know if you want to speak to some of those, Bridget.
Yeah, I find that interesting because when I've interacted with people who are using service dogs for this type of work, they tend to be a different breed, right? If you're getting one from an organization, you're likely seeing your friendly labs, your friendly Goldens, maybe a poodle. But a lot of the owner training side of things, you're using different breeds. And the more I hate to label this because I don't agree with it, but the idea of the more intimidating breeds, right? A Rottweiler, a German Shepherd. And those are the type of dogs that are going to receive more public access challenge because of the inherent stigma of those breeds.
Even though
right?
you see shepherds out there as PTSD dogs because they're so smart.
And they're so
smart.
vigilant on the external.
Yes.
right?
And when you get those, oh, I love shepherds. That was my first exposure to working with dogs, actually, was working with shepherds in kennels. They were detection dogs and they're incredible. But if you do, and they're so smart, but when you have a smart dog, the caveat of that is you got to stimulate them. And if you don't, that's where you're going to end up with all these behavior difficulties or challenges that you see where these dogs are getting the stigma. But when you really think about it, they are such a predominant working breed because they are so intelligent and so incredible and so sweet to the person that they are connected with.
And shepherds make a great owner trainer dog, right? Because they are very loyal to one person. Whereas, and you might have, I don't know how you've seen this, but shepherds in those larger organizations, when they have to transfer from so many different handlers, they're going to react very differently.
No, you
than
get
a
your
lab.
labs. Yeah, you get our little goofy labs that love to work for food. They're the perfect
Yeah.
dogs to train. Love
Here,
it.
you take the
Here
lab,
you
you take
goofball.
the-
Yes.
They just
Yeah,
do
you
the
don't. Their
same.
temperament is amazing. This might be controversy, but I'm like, if you mess up a lab, you have messed up. Like, you need some help. Go get a trainer now because they are just,
Just a willing dog.
yes. Yeah. I love them.
If you've got a cookie, you've got their attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I think that, of course, the breed stigma is a problem in terms of access challenges. And I don't want to go too deep into this part of it on this episode, but I think that the lack of proper policies and standards, because you're walking in to these businesses and you've got these workers who are not well versed on what we're talking about. So you might get an access challenge because they don't understand what a working dog is. So I think a lot more education in terms of how our standards, our laws, and how employees are trained can help alleviate this, but we have to be realistic and understand that's a big task. So, before we wrap things up, we do realize that some of the things we've talked about might have been difficult, and we want to make sure that you leave here knowing that you're supported. We're going to link some information in the podcast notes section related to technology safety because we recognize that violence doesn't just occur in person, it can happen online. But also a list of resources related to intimate partner violence, child abuse, and animal abuse in case you have issues of concern that you need assistance with.
So we're going to do that on our YouTube video. And then we're also going to link it on our Instagram account. If you just go to the main page, you'll see some links there provided. Click on them and then visit the sites for some supports.
So I know we've moved the conversation slightly into we're asking a lot of these dogs. So why don't you tune in to our next episode where we're going to talk about what service dogs actually do for trauma? Unleashed,
The Service Dog Gals.
trauma, disability, and who gets left out.